Hey, it's me. I wanted to do something different from my usual content on this channel. I decided, it was either a month and a half ago or 2 months at this point, to make an animation to announce that Renegades Volume 2 is finally coming out. You know, after 2 delays, it's finally done. I can't believe it either. But this animation for that, despite its short length, I mean, it's not even 2 minutes long, it was a lot of work, and I really wish I had Agent Smith's powers to make copies of myself to get this done faster. So I'm gonna break down everything that went into this animation just because I think it's kind of interesting. Spoiler alert, there was a lot of crunch involved. When I mean crunch, I mean I was working on this up until like 2 hours before I showed it on the live stream. That's the levels of crunch we're dealing with here. A lot of late nights went into this, so let's get into it. The original idea for this animation was way more complicated than what we got. And that's because I overestimated how long this was going to take and how difficult making character models was going to be. Even though I've had trouble with this in the past, for some reason I fooled myself to think I had enough time to do all the character models that I originally intended to have here. Because originally the animation was actually going to have Sierra in it. There was going to be a point where she and Ronan are on the bridge and looking at the main antagonist, because the main antagonist, he threatens the entire island and stuff and basically kicks off the whole finale. I can't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil the book for you guys because it ain't even out yet. And, but the scene was supposed to have Ronan like balling his fist, and then it was gonna cut to him standing in a street where there's burning cars and like hints of like electricity and stuff around, so he's about to square off against the main antagonist. The tank that you saw for like 2 seconds in the final animation was gonna get deployed by a shuttle onto a street, and then later on you were gonna see it in a different location. It was about to fight something else. Again, I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil what happens during like the end battle of the book, because there's a lot that happens in that. But I actually started on Sierra's model first, and I had sculpted most of it. The face is nowhere near done, so I'm not going to show too much of it because it was really unfinished, and I'm thinking about going back and finishing it later and, you know, trying to make it neater and everything. But what I can show you was the original way the tank was going to land in the street, because I did like a previs of that. It's rough, and the buildings are about as placeholder as you can get, so keep that in mind. Eat your heart out, Miyazaki. Let me not even joke about that. Miyazaki would be the person to come at you and like roast you for even making that joke. I feel like. Okay, but I might as well give you a better look at the shuttle model since it ended up not being used in the final animation. Originally, this was intended to be the previs model for it, but I ended up liking the design so much that I was like, I might be able to get away with using this. And the original plan was to redo it with the city model I had and everything in the street. But as I was working on building the city and the self-imposed deadline of May 24th was very rapidly approaching, I just didn't have time to do that. But here's what the shuttle looks like in a little more detail. It also has a different cell shader setup on it than what I ended up using in the final shots. But that would have been a pretty easy fix if I did end up using it. And I kind of wish I did now because I really like how it turned out. I'd have to add some more color to it though, so it isn't one note, but it's fine for what it is. I based the design off an insect. I was looking at pictures of wasps and cicadas to get the shape of the main section, and I just sort of winged it for the wing parts. Pun not intended.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I thought about giving it some kind of like retractable landing gear so it actually landed like a bug or something like that, but since this model was originally only going to be for previs purposes and wasn't going to be in the final version, I just didn't bother. Originally, you were also going to see the Renegade ship, the Laika, in the air and stuff. I actually could have shown it since I did make the model for it. I don't know how long ago I made that model. The only thing I'd had to do was change the shaders on it, maybe fix some of the panels, because the way I did the panels was kind of dumb. But the other thing I'd had to do is I'd had to make the ship all one object or pairing everything together so it could move without me having to move each thing individually, because that'd be unbelievably frustrating because there's so many pieces. But for some reason, that file is really unstable and it likes to freeze and crash a lot. because I tried to import it into something else at one point and it just wouldn't do it. That was one of the reasons why I ended up not making it in the final thing. Also, since I had dropped the idea of the team shuttle dropping from the tank, because originally it was supposed to show the shuttle leaving the ship and everything, since I cut all that out, it just didn't make sense to have it there. And also, again, time constraints. The main antagonist, the one featured on the cover that should be behind me right now, he was going to get his own character model, and he was supposed to be in a giant ball of electricity, and then he was going to end that and land the street in front of Ronan, and the two were going to have a good old stare down for a few seconds before attacking each other. But due to me underestimating how long it was going to take just to make Ronan's model, it still isn't even done, I ended up having to scrap that. So, yeah, like, given how like Ronan's model, again, wasn't done, and I was struggling and I was running out of time, there was just no way in hell I was going to be able to do it in the time frame I had. But let's stop talking about what ifs and talk about how this thing actually got made in the first place. The city took a while to make. I want to say it took me about 2.5 to maybe arguably 3 days to do all that of work, you know, in between other stuff that I had to do. But I started making a basic plane and giving it a black texture, then I started blocking out streets and buildings. The city might look big in the final shot, but it's actually really small. In fact, it's so small that when I initially imported Ronan's model in for scale, he was gigantic compared to it. It was starting to look like a tokusatsu set off Wish.com or something. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about that, doing an animation with a kaiju just for fun, that actually could be a pretty fun project. I might have to do that at some point when I get better at 3D modeling, like creatures and stuff, and rigging and animating them, which we'll get into that later, because oh boy. But going back to scaling, figuring that out was kind of tricky because there were points where the streets were way too tall, and like the sidewalks was too high and everything, and it just looked weird. I very loosely based the way the city looks off of Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, and I do say loosely because I mostly just use it as reference for like the central street, which you really don't see that much of anyway. But once I had a decent placement of the buildings, I started adding details to the streets. I didn't go overboard because I figured since this is supposed to be at night and the entire city has lost power anyway, I could get away with not adding too much. But I started with street lights and traffic lights, which were pretty simple to make, especially since you weren't going to be up close to them or anything. I didn't realize that even with the fog I added, the volumetric fog, to try and, you know, give more of that night setting and make the lighting look better and everything, make everything more moody, the buildings still looked really flat, so I went in and detailed most of them, at least the ones that were closest to the camera. But one issue I quickly started running into was my VRAM usage. So if you don't know, you know how your computer has RAM for like, you know, random access memory for like when you have usually getting devoured by your browser tabs. Let's be real, if you're running a Chromium browser, even Firefox, now that I think about it, eats up so much RAM now, it's ridiculous. Well, your graphics card has its own RAM called video RAM, hence the V in front of it. And despite my graphics card having 12 gigabytes of VRAM, the scene was starting to use up quite a bit. It was getting to the point where it was using over half of it, depending on what I had added to the scene. And I was concerned I was going to run out when, you know, I started adding stuff like embers, wreck cars, animations for Ronan's model and such. I wasn't sure what was going to affect the VRAM usage. So I started dialing back how much detail I wanted to add. But another thing that was really tricky was the lighting. And lighting in general is kind of one of those things where it's like, it's going to make or break whatever you're doing, because if the lighting's bad, I don't care how detailed you make the model, it's going to look fake if the lighting's weird, or it's not going to look that great anyway. But lighting something for a night scene is, I think, a little more difficult, because you either make it too dark and then nobody can see anything and you get something like Alien vs. Predator Requiem, which if you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about, because you can't see anything. It is dark, and I'm not talking about in tone, although it is that too. Or you end up being too bright and it doesn't look like a nighttime shot, and then the things that aren't that detailed because you hope you'd hide them with the darkness, you can now see them, so now you gotta go back and add more detail, or you gotta make the scene darker. So it was a ton of trial and error with that, and I spent a lot of time playing around with that. One thing I decided early on was, because, good lord, I ain't trying to do photorealism, and also because, to me, doing stuff like photorealistic textures and stuff on stylized characters can look really weird, depending on how you do it. I decided to try and go for like an anime style, specifically like a 90s cel-shaded look. And it just so happened a post from an account that I follow on Minds called Infinity Arc explained that during the 80s and early 90s, doing like city shots at night, animes did a lot of blues and purples and even red lighting. So I added that to the scene. I added some blue lights and then some red in there and little bits of purple. I also had to find a balance of the fog too, because if I had it turned up too high, you really couldn't see anything and it wouldn't read that you were in a city. It would just look like you were in the middle of nowhere. But if I didn't have enough of it, then you could see where like the city actually ended and there weren't buildings, there should be. I also realized as I was building this that I needed to add crosswalks and street markers. I figured out a really stupid way to do that. I added a plane and then used a wave texture to make the lines, and then I just played around with the amount and the width of them to try and get it to look accurate. I did something similar for the regular street markings too, but that was a little bit more complicated. In hindsight, I should have probably figured out a way to add some like weathering to it, because if you've ever looked at, especially on a street that's used a lot, like the lines aren't perfect. There's like fading and parts where it's been like washed away and stuff. I could have added a little bit of that. But again, time. And I ended up not using that much of the street markers anyway, or markings I should say, in the final animation, but it's there in some places. I also made sure to build the scene in a way where I could easily move the buildings around to change how the streets were and what was in the background depending on where the camera was. I did try to add some damage and debris to the ground and other little details to try and make it seem less flat, but they didn't turn out looking that good, so I ended up scrapping them, and again, I was concerned about the VRAM. Man, I am so glad the plot of this book has the city being completely without power, because otherwise I would have to spend countless hours making different holographic signs and animations for them. In hindsight though, I probably could have added stuff like puddles or trash on the sidewalks to give them a little more detail, but again, I was a little worried about the VRAM. But let's move on to the other things that the city needed. So the cop cars are actually the same ones I used as a transition slide during that mega long Cyrex vid I did a long time ago, the one that covered the whole Tibbs saga. I planned on making another police car model because the one that I made for that transition slide, I threw that together in a couple of hours and it really wasn't well thought out at all. I just slapped it together last minute, basically. But when I placed into the shot as a placeholder to get like the scaling stuff, it actually ended up looking okay. I just had to go and redo the textures so it had the cell shaded look. And I did have to mess around with the scaling a bit because they were too large, especially if I put them next to Ronin's model. Like, he looked like an absolute manlet next to them. Then I just made multiple copies of the cars and then deleted parts of them to make them look like they were damaged, just for, added detail and stuff. But next were the civilian cars, and originally I wanted to keep that as simple as possible, and I planned on making multiple different types of cars, like a minivan, an SUV, a floating truck that had like a trailer behind it and all that. But I ended up spending way too much time modeling one car, mostly because I kept adding panels to it. Because when I initially was adding panels, every time I stopped and thought it looked fine, I would look at the whole model and realize, yeah, this needs more panels because it looks weird to have the front of it be paneled, but the rest of it not. And that ended up eating up more time than I expected it to. And at this point, I had maybe 2 days left if I was lucky, if I really wanted to stretch it. And none of the scenes were properly set up or close to done yet, so I ended up having to just go with one car model and just making it different colors. And I decided as a joke to add the Tales of the Edgeworlds cover as a decal on one of the cars as like a silly little Easter egg that you can totally see in the final shot because the fire and smoke and darkness totally didn't cover that up and made it almost impossible to see it. Oh well. Speaking of fire and smoke, fire is something that can be a royal pain in the ass to do in Blender, especially if you want to do a fire sim to make it ultra realistic or even slightly believable because, oh man, that takes a long time to render, and if you're using the real-time render engine Eevee, it has a hard time making fire look decent, so that means you'd have to use cycles, which is way slower and can take hours to render 30 seconds of animation, for example, depending on your sample size and all that stuff. And also, that would eat up way too much time doing that. But like I said, fire sims take a long time to render, not to mention you have to wait for the computer to then calculate the simulation and bake it. And if the bake sim doesn't look good, you gotta delete the bake, change the parameters, try again, and then repeat as necessary until you finally got it looking the way you want. But fortunately, there's another way to do this without a fire sim. You can do it as a texture, you can fake it. And a lot of games do this, especially for stylized effects, because good lord, if you try to do an actual fire sim in a game engine, I imagine it would just tank your frame rate, especially if it's calculating that every frame in real time. You'd have to have a freaking supercomputer to do that. But I found this really neat tutorial for making stylized anime flames, and I just followed that. The way it works is the texture on a plane, and it's manipulated every frame using drivers, so it never stops animating because, you know, fire doesn't stop moving. But once that was done, I had to put into the scene, and I think it looked pretty good. I had to position them so it wasn't obvious they were just flat images. It also helped to hide the fact that the cars are supposed to be damaged, and sometimes I didn't add anything to make them look damaged, so the flames help hide that, or hide the fact that the cars don't have interiors at all. To add a little bit more character, I decided to do things like ripping off the bumper of one of the cars and adding fire to that, making it look like one of the cop cars that crashed into something, and that's engulfed in fire. Next was the smoke. I just reused this anime smoke effect that I made for the Tales of the Edge Worlds reveal, since it looked alright, and the alternative of you making a smoke sim. And yeah, take everything I said about the fire sim and just, it's literally the same thing, and I wasn't about to deal with that. The embers were pretty easy. I just put a plane behind the camera and made it a particle emitter, and set the particles to small cubes that I elongated into rectangles, and then threw a glowing orange texture on them, and then turned on motion blur in the render so you couldn't easily tell they were blocks. And then I added a turbulence force field so they moved in a way that looked a little bit convincing. I'm not sure if it's the most realistic physics for embers. I ain't no physics expert. But the last thing I had to do for the first shot was a police barricade, which, I'm gonna be honest, if it wasn't for the Japanese writing on that and me adding text in the top left in the final edit, I could have passed the city off as literally anywhere in the world. I doubt anyone would be able to tell what it was supposed to be. Speaking of that, I had initially blocked out where the police barricades were, and then I went into a separate file and made both the rods that project the barrier and the barrier itself. I got the Japanese writing using Deep L to translate what I had written in English and the Japanese, and then double checked it by running it through Google Translate to see if it actually was what I was trying to say, and hopefully that's right, because I don't know enough Japanese to confidently say that what I wrote is accurate or not. Then I pasted it into the text objects to make them look holographic by manipulating the texture, and there's a bunch of notes. Originally I had the idea of animating it so the text appeared to be scrolling and switching between English and Japanese, but I was short on time and I was in full kiss mode. Not that one, the keep it simple stupid rule. The finishing touches was animating the cop cars to bob up and down, and then adding lights to the police siren so they illuminated more of the area and making them flicker a little bit, and then adding some more details to the street so they weren't quite so flat. I added some posters that I don't think you can even see them, that are there. Also added a knocked over trash can that's untextured, and some extra details to the bases of the buildings where they connected a sidewalk, just so it didn't look so flat. I then added these flashing lights that were yellow and blue. The yellow lights were meant to imitate like gunshots off screen, because like the idea was the cops are trying to stop the main antagonist and failing at it, and the blue was supposed to be blasts of electricity. At one point in my delusional, overly ambitious brain, I thought I was gonna have time to add full sound to this thing. I'm still laughing about that, because I don't know what the hell I was thinking on that one. But I actually did have a gunshot sound effect, because Joker Blade at one point went to a shooting range and was firing a deagle, and he sent me a video of him doing that. So I was gonna rip the sound from that and, I don't know, throw some reverb on it to make it seem like the gunshots are more distant and edit that around. But again, there was just no way how I was gonna be adding sound effects to this in the time I have. But wow, I spent a lot of time talking about the city. Let's go to the other things I made for this video. I spent 2 to 3 hours working on the HUD. It's probably the thing that I'm actually the most happy about, because it ended up turning out really nice. I designed this thinking this is like a screen that Ada, the AI controlling the main character's ship, had control over, like it was an interface with her. Hence why it mentions an operating system and says Ada 0 on it. If you've read the first book, you know what that means. I actually made 2 versions of the UI. There was one from a different perspective and had some things on it, like a communications check with the entire team, and the latitude and longitude coordinates for Tokyo City, just to add more detail for absolutely no reason, and just because I feel like it would be something that's on the UI, and I doubt anybody caught that without me pointing it out, but maybe somebody did. And there's one thing that I use it in a video, but I don't think you can see it very well. There's a version number for Ada's AI, and there's a part of it that's a reference to the release date of the first book. There's the 17.21 part, which the original book was released on September 17th, 2021. Yeah, it's been 3 years and I finally got to the sequel. I'm gonna try and get these out faster, guys. I apologize for that. But the initial colors were supposed to be white and gold, since in the lore, the AI was made by the Excelis Corporation. But then I realized Isaac and Tech, or Ada herself, would probably change that since they're no longer affiliated with Excelis. So I changed the colors to match Isaac and Tech since they invented the AI anyway. Thought it was fitting and I think it looks pretty good. I don't know, I'll let you guys decide. I'll put both of them up on the screen. You can tell me which version you like better. The blocks of code are copied from a Python template that's used for, I guess, if you want to make UI edits to Blender for whatever reason. I just copy pasted that in the text and then gave it an emission shader so it glows. The rings are made up of circle objects that I then extruded so they actually had some thickness to them. And then I broke them apart into sections and slapped emission shaders on that and just animate them to rotate in different ways. Some are going clockwise, some are going counterclockwise just for the sake of variety. The grid is actually using a grid object, which I didn't even know that was a thing in Blender, but it is. Then I just threw on a wireframe modifier and that does exactly what you think it does. It turns whatever you put it on into a wireframe of that object, and you can control the thickness of it to make it thicker or thinner, however you want to go about it. And that's what the wireframe orbs are. They're different types of spheres with wireframe modifiers on them. The waves are me taking a plane, giving it a bunch of faces, then using Blender's built-in ocean modifier, which again does exactly what you think it does. It makes the plane into an ocean. Then I just had to shrink the size down because it makes it huge because, you know, it's supposed to be an ocean. And then just do the wireframe on top of that and then just animated it. The wireframe waves, they did make it into the final shot, but because of the perspective you're at and the depth of field I had on and make the UI pop more, they're barely visible. Then I put a black plane behind the UI and then copied parts of it around and animated them doing stuff just for variety. Then I had to figure out what I was going to do with the text, and I was originally going to use the same text reveal setup I use in my other videos for transitions. But I wanted this to be fast and exciting, so I decided to do something different. I had the text be invisible and then took a cube with a glowing shader on it and I had it fly in a frame and then disappear and then reveal the text, and then I added a particle system with glowing particles and then threw in some force fields so they moved around and looked cool. It actually was kind of simple to set up and it was easy to change it for each of the different text parts. And then I decided to add extra details for each piece of text to make the text sequence more varied. Like the first one, I made a warning message saying power failure as a way to communicate that the city is without power in case it wasn't obvious with how dark it was. For the save the city part, I just added stuff to further show the stakes that the bombs are gonna go off if the renegades don't do something, and that if they don't, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be really bad. If they don't. Oh yeah, that glitch in the text. Yeah, I'm not gonna tell you who the save her text is referring to. You'll have to read the book for that one when it comes out. Sorry, no spoilers here, or at least I'm gonna try and keep them to a minimum. Just know the city ain't the only thing that's in danger during this story. That other glitch I can talk about more though, it's the logo for the Osiris Corporation. They're a giant mega corporation and the second largest on the planet. They're also not a big fan of non-humans, so kind of Cerberus vibes from Mass Effect. That was one of the inspirations for them. The Umbrella Corporation was another one. If you read the first book, they actually tried to abduct Isaac and Tech at the very start of it. Without saying too much, they play a big role in the events of book 2, so I had to make their logo to represent that. I think I accidentally made the bad guys logo way too cool, and making the upside down pyramid was surprisingly easy. It's just a modified cube. What was tricky was getting the eye, and this is specifically the eye of Horus, which given how Horus is Osiris's kid in Egyptian mythology, that felt kind of appropriate. Also just because it looks cool. No, it's not an Illuminati logo, even though I could see someone thinking that. It took me a while to make that eye, even though I had someone had a stencil online for it. I just kind of traced it out with a plane, but I'm surprised how well it turned out. Regardless, the font was the biggest pain because I didn't want to use a generic font for it. I wanted to look unique, and I also didn't want to risk using like a font from one of those font websites because some of them they're like you can't use something that's for profit, and I didn't know if using it in a YouTube video to advertise something would count. To play it safe, I said,
"Fine, I'll do it myself."
Spent a decent amount of time on something that you wouldn't see for more than like 2 seconds of that. I think it's even less than a second, but that's kind of what happens in animation regardless of any medium. I think people spend a lot of time on things that barely get seen or even really that appreciated unless you're going frame by frame, which most people aren't doing that. The glitching was done in my editing software following a glitch tutorial, and then I messed with it a bit and added more stuff on top of it to make it look even more distorted. So it was harder for you to catch what was being revealed there. While editing the template I had for the text, I decided to change the UI based on the situation a bit just for the sake of variety. I just played around with the colors and stuff. But let's move on to the tank scene. I had two different ideas, or really three ideas for what I was going to do with the tank. I ended up picking option 2. Option 1 was to have the camera hovering above the street, and it was going to be like you were watching it from a news helicopter, like you were watching a news report of what's happening, even though I realized now that I think about it, that wouldn't make any sense because the whole city is out of power. So, you know, what would you be watching it on, I guess? Because I would include like the internet being down, I guess. Well, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how that works. Do they have... I don't know how that works. The cell towers have their own backup power. Maybe they do. I don't know. But the idea was it was going to be text explaining that the authorities believe this is the same tank the Renegade stole from Guardian months ago, because the tank is painted with the colors of Guardian, which is a completely different faction, and it didn't come across clearly if you just look at the tank that who was driving it. That's why I added the text in the final shot to make that clear. But the other option was to have the tank drift around a corner, and I wanted to make the drift more dramatic, like it was dangerously close to hitting one of the buildings, but it corrects itself at the last second, and it was going to kind of throw the turret out like a counterweight to sort of correct itself. I couldn't quite get it to do what I wanted to do with the drift around the corner, and that's because of how I had to set up the tank, because I used a path object and shaped it in a way so it banked around the corner and moved somewhat naturally, because otherwise if I animated it by hand, it would do a lot of stopping and starting, and it just would look weird. The only problem with the path is it's hard to control, like, at least for me anyway. I couldn't figure out a way to slow it down at points, so it ends up coming around the corner a little too fast, which does kind of work because it plays up the urgency of the situation, but I feel like something that heavy should not be that fast, especially when it's changing direction. But it is what it is. I'm not gonna stress out about it too much. But as I said, I did have to add some text just so it was clear who was piloting the tank. I also had to redo the shaders for the tank since I ended up doing a different cell shadings. But I'll go ahead and show you a nice 360 of the tank in a more well-lit setting, because I actually think it looks way better there than it does at night. Alright, so this scene was one I spent a lot of time on. For context, the bombs are planted at a power plant. I really wanted this to be as tense as possible to convey that there are stakes here. It's not just, oh, stop the villains and that's it. Nah, there's a lot more going on than that. The model for the bombs actually wasn't that bad, but what was the real nightmare was getting the counter, the timer for the digits and stuff. I had to make a sprite sheet from, 0 to 9, and then put that on a plane as a texture and size it so only one number was visible at a time. Then through some texture wizardry and manipulating the faces and following a tutorial from a channel called CG Matter, which, man, that tutorial became hard to follow at the end when he was setting up the other digits, because he went through that so fast. I had to stop and restart a bunch of times to get it the way it was supposed to be. And it was a nightmare to make the numbers count down the way I wanted. Once I had that nightmare sorted, I had to work on the pylons.
You must construct additional pylons.
In the book, this area is described as like a metal forest of bamboo, but that's like glowing and has electricity running off it and things like that. So that was kind of a basis. The hardest thing was getting the lighting right on that, because I wanted there to be enough fog to hide the lack of detail in the area. But again, you still have to be able to see everything, or at least most of the area. So I had to make the fog thick, which meant I had to crank up the glow on the glowing parts of it. I also added a giant light and made it orange to represent fire off screen. I used this other trick which has a funny name. It's called a cookie. I know that sounds weird, but what it is it's a plane you put in, it's a thing you put in front of the light that has holes in it, so the light is cast through it in like interesting ways. And what I did was I manipulated the cookie every frame so it made it look like the light was moving to try and create the illusion that they're shifting flames off camera. It wasn't very noticeable, at least I don't think it was that noticeable in the final shot, at least not as how I pictured it in my head, but again, I was running low on time and it is what it is. I also added a particle system to try and have some debris floating in the air, but due to the darkness of the scene, it's really not that noticeable. At least the embers came out alright. For this one, I just took a bunch of the car models and added fire and removed parts of them. The hardest thing to do was trying to position the flames so they looked convincing from the angle of the camera. Then I had to make a lightning bolt object. Making that wasn't too bad, although I did use a tutorial to help. And then what I did was I showed and hit it really quickly. when I wanted it to strike. Trying to get the timing was tricky. I think I might have made it too fast, but the reason why it was so difficult is because for whatever reason, trying to play that back in the viewport was laggy as hell, so I couldn't quite, guesstimate the timing based on that, so I had to do test renders and then look at the test render, then either add more frames or reduce the amount of frames, then test render it again and repeat as necessary, and that ended up taking a lot of time. So eventually I kind of was just like, alright, that looks fine, and just went with it. Though one of the things I probably should have done is shook the camera a bit to make the lighting have more impact or added smoke to it. Hindsight being 2020 and all. As for the burn marks after the strike hits, that was just a plane with a texture on it that branched out from the center like a sphere. I did that using a node in Blender called a gradient node, and I set it to, I think it's called quadratic sphere. I then hit it until the lightning hit the ground just to add a little bit more detail. As for the 2 seconds of sparks that show up during the animation, that was using an emitter, and I think I used icospheres for that, which are just these, they're not completely smooth spheres, they're more like triangular looking. They're great for if you're using particles, because using UV spheres for that is just way too many faces, unless you're only, I don't know, doing like 10 particles or something, or you're really getting up close to them and you want them to look actually spherical. But that was just it for that. And then the book objects themselves were reused from previous renders of the first book. I just changed the image textures to the covers for the second book and then made that a new object. I did the same thing with the tablet too, because that one was even easier. I just took the cover and just slapped it onto the screen and played around with the emission value so you could actually see it and make out everything clearly. Although I forgot to add the version of the cover that has my name on the side of it before I made the shot, but it's fine. It still looks pretty clean. But let's move on to the penultimate shot, which, oh boy, this one was surprisingly difficult. I'm not exaggerating at all when I say I spent almost an entire day on this. Actually, no, I spent more than a day on this, because I remember the night before I spent the entire day on this, I was figuring out how to make the objects, and I was making the lightning object, which took a little while, but the stream of pressurized water took a lot longer, because it's difficult to try and make a cylinder look like pressurized water without having to make a fluid sim and then figuring out how to make the fluid shoot out like that and actually look like it has some force behind it and all that. And you best believe, if you think fire sims take a while to make, fluid sims are way worse. Especially if you're adding things like foam or spray particles to make it look more realistic. I tried doing that once, and it drove me mad with how long it took to bake. And it didn't even look that good to begin with, so that meant I had to crank it up even more if I wanted it to at least look convincingly like water, and ain't nobody got time for that, especially with the time frame I had. Also, that would have looked out of place because everything else is very stylized anyway. So what I did to make the water stream was I used a cylinder and then textured it in a way where it kind of looks like that, and then I added a driver on top of it, so it's constantly moving just to hide the fact that it's a cylinder, so parts of it are visible and parts of it aren't. And then I copied it twice and resized them and colored one white so it looks like water foam and stuff, and I threw, like I said, threw drivers on it, so it's constantly animating. The effect for when the water collides with electricity was actually pretty easy. What I did was I took a sphere, diced it in half, and then tossed a modifier on it called the displacement modifier. It does exactly what it says. It displaces the geometry of the object's surface so it's not uniform. It's pretty good if you want to make hills or uneven terrain. The lightning one is the exact same thing. I just did it with a glowing shader, and I think I use a different texture for the displacement. Then I had to animate them shrinking and lengthening so it looks like one side was winning the beam fight and make it look more dynamic. For whatever reason, the animated textures made the viewport display lag out like crazy, so that's what really took so long, was getting the timings of everything right so it wasn't too fast or too slow. I had to do a bunch of test renders, then watch test renders, then make the changes, then repeat the process until it ended up looking okay. And yes, this is about as tedious as it sounds. I had so many test renders to make sure it all turned out okay, and that was even before I did the stuff like with the explosion or the smoke, and then timing, the text tip, that took even, oh boy, that was a lot. But the explosion effect itself was just a sphere with a glowing shader on it that I made it shrink and expand. Then I made a second sphere with a shader on it that looked like smoke, and then I animated that so the smoke would fade in and out and be moving. The electrified title, I just grabbed that from the initial announcement I did years ago. Wow, time really does fly, huh? I just grabbed that and reused it since it looked good enough and it fit the style where I was going with. But let's move on to the final shot. The final shot was pretty simple. It was just using shaders on the text and animating it so the text appears to be glitched out. Last minute though, I looked at the background, thought it was kind of boring, so I added some cubes to act as buildings, and I added another sphere with an emission shader on it to look like the moon. Although I then ended up obscuring that with a lot of fog anyway, because it actually ended up looking too distracting and it made it harder to read the text, so I had to do something to it. But fans of book 1 might recognize what that white and green logo is. It's Guardian's logo, and it was originally drawn by my frequent co-host Slim. I just took it and made it into an object in Blender and then made it glow and made it look like a hologram. As for the kunai for the second short story, well, those are for a character you haven't met yet, but I hope you'll like them when book 2 comes out. Alright, I think we're done here. You were probably wondering when I was going to talk about this for the entire video, weren't you? Ronin's model was a massive time sink. In fact, it was so massive I had to stop working on it because there was no way I could finish this on time on top of everything else. This was the thing that terrified me most about the 3D modeling when it came to making this animation, because I am absolute dog water when it comes to making organic stuff in Blender. Making a character model, especially an organic one, has a lot going into it, a lot more than you think. First, I had to block out everything using basic shapes, then combine them all, and then begin sculpting. I am absolutely terrible at Anatomy 2 and sculpting things and getting them to look passable. I spent somewhere between, I think, 2 days, maybe even 3 on sculpting alone. The biggest hurdle was the face. The initial attempt at making the face was, well, bro looking like a gray that got lost at Burning Man or something. So I had to scrap the face and try it again, and I think his face turned out better, although I think he kind of looks too much like a kid, especially when he's smiling. But given some things that you find out in book 2, him kind of looking young actually works. I also made a grave mistake with his hands. Remember how I said I was trash when it comes to anatomy? Well, that includes hands, because I accidentally put his thumb too high up on the hand and also made the palms too big, so that causes issues later when I try to animate his hands doing things, so thankfully you don't get a good look at his hands. And somehow I didn't notice that the thumb was in the wrong place and the palms were too big until I was so far in, I'd have to undo several hours worth of progress to fix it, because at this point the hands were fused to the body and had so many polygons that my computer was dying trying to load the file. So I had to just say, you know what, it is what it is, and press on without fixing it. Then came the second worst part of character modeling, retopology. To try and not boggle down this video with technical stuff, and also because this is like 50 times longer than the animation itself at this point. Holy shit, I've been talking for a while on this. But to make this basic, retopology is where you create a simpler version of the model with better face distribution, so when you go to animate it, A, your computer doesn't lag out and take eternity to make the arm move, and B, when you move the arm, it actually looks decent and deforms properly. It's a pretty mandatory step unless you're doing like a low poly model and you kept the face distribution in mind as you were making the model. But basically what you're doing is you're rebuilding your entire model all over again, but in a less intensive manner, so you can actually rig an animated thing without your computer having a stroke, hopefully. The way you do this is you take a new object. Most people usually use a plane because a lot of the faces are going to end up being squares anyway. You toggle on some options so the square clings to the surface of your model, and you project it so you can always see it on top of the model, so you can see what you're doing easier. And then you create more squares, and eventually you cover the entire model in squares. You add more edges in places where you need it. Yeah, this is just as boring and tedious to do as it is to watch, trust me. On the rare occasions where I've tried to do this, I usually use an add-on called Quad Remesher. that can do it for you. However, it has less control than if you did it by hand, and sometimes you can end up with more faces than you need for areas, especially if you're trying to do something where you want to keep the poly count lower, like a video game character, for example. I originally did the quad remesh for Ronin's model, but I wasn't happy with it, especially when I tried to fast track the rigging process using a built-in add-on for Blender called Meta Rig, which generates the rig for you. The Meta Rig did not like me modifying it anyway. It's very temperamental, at least when I try to mess with it. So I had to rig it from scratch. Well, first I had to do the topology from scratch by hand and then rig it. Oh boy, retopologizing Ronin's model, it drove me to drink, I'm not gonna lie. So although it is basically remaking the model one square at a time, there's more to it than that. In order to get the model to deform the way you want so it looks right when you start animating certain parts of it, you have to lay out the faces in specific ways. This is usually around joints like the elbows, the knees, the shoulders, the front of the chest. You want to have faces on, well, the face, more of them anyway, especially around the mouth, because that's how you convey emotion usually with a character, on top of how they're standing, but usually it's the mouth and the eyes. So those are definitely areas where you want as many faces as you can, and you want to make sure that it animates in a way that looks convincing, even if you're going for a stylized look. Especially if you're going to put the camera really close to the face. I mean, if you're not going to show the character's face, you don't have to do that. But if you are, you got to make sure the topology on the face around the eyes and mouth look decent. There's also specific techniques you're supposed to use to get the face distribution to work correctly. I tried to follow those as best I could, but I don't know why, but for some reason, I had issues where sometimes the squares wouldn't operate the way I wanted them to. And it was probably due to this one modifier that makes the squares conform to the body of the model more, but for whatever reason, there were areas where it would go haywire, especially on Ronin's gigantic ears. I'm not even kidding, I'm not being hyperbolic here. I spent hours on those big ass ears and Blender was just not having it. I'm not gonna go too into the technicals of retopology. There's plenty of tutorials out there that can explain that way better than I can because I'm a complete scrub at it and anything I say would just be parroted from them anyway. But let's just say that it's a mandatory step, especially if your model, you did sculpting and it's very high poly, because the poly count on Ronin's model before I retopologized it was ridiculous to the point where my computer was lagging out just loading and saving it. So if I tried to rig that and tried to animate that, oh man, I think my computer would have a stroke. But you really want to have the topology good, especially if you plan on importing it into like a game engine or something, because otherwise your game is going to run like an absolute slideshow and you're going to have plenty of angry people on YouTube talking about how your game runs like dog shit, and you don't want that. After I don't even know how many hours I spent on this. I finished retopologizing the model, and then I had to move on to the other thing that I absolutely hate.
Rigging.
Rigging is building a skeleton that allows you to control the model. That is the simplest way I think I can boil that down. Now, that doesn't sound too difficult on paper, right? You just build bones for the legs, the arms, the spine, the torso, the neck, bones that control the head, bones that control the mouth, bones that control the jaw, bones that control where the eyes are looking, bones that control the areas around the eyes, so you can have the brows move up and down, bones for controlling the fingers, bones for controlling, in Ronin's case, the tentacles coming out of his head, and bones that control his ears. Yeah, that's actually a little more complicated than I thought, now that I say it out loud. But getting the basic bone setup wasn't that bad. One thing I did realize when I finished rigging his model was that he can't blink for whatever reason. I tried so many different ways to rig around the eyes to see if I could pull it off, but I wasn't having much luck with that for whatever reason. I should mention part of the original plan was you were supposed to see him without the mask on, so it was clear who he is. And then he's supposed to put the mask on, so I kinda wanted to have his face emote and stuff and be detailed for like the few seconds you saw it. But I could live with him not blinking. I also learned my horrible mistakes with the hands. Basically, I messed up both the retopology and his palms were too long, so his fingers couldn't quite curl up into the hand when you make a fist or grabbing something. And then the thumb was just a lost cause. Also, the way his fingers bend didn't look right, and they didn't quite have the best range of motion either. I think that was due to both the retopology, me not placing the bones in the correct spots, and also just the way I did the fingers. So it's a bunch of compounding issues with that. But it was still manageable since you weren't supposed to be looking at his hands anyway. What was a bigger problem was the method for making controlling the arms and legs easier. You see, there's something called inverse kinematics. I don't know all the technicals for it, so I'm just gonna kind of keep it simple. But what setting inverse kinematics does is allows you to control an entire chain of bones. I'll use the legs, for example. You can control the entire leg with just a single bone. It allows the model to animate things automatically based on what you're doing. Well, let's say you had your character drop their hips really low. If you had the inverse kinematics on, if your hips drop below a certain point, the knees would bend automatically. Or if you grab the character's spine and raised it up, the character's feet would move with it, so it's like they're jumping. So it makes certain things a little bit easier. And it can save you time with animating the legs. On paper, it's relatively easy to set up. It only requires you to make 2 extra bones and then turn on the inverse kinematic modifiers. You also have to make sure that those 2 bones are not set to deform, or otherwise you'll get some weird stuff in there. But you're probably wondering, if it's so easy to set up on paper, why do I dread this so much? Let's just say me and an inverse kinematics have a hostile relationship. For whatever reason, when I try to rig this up with legs, they like to rotate when they shouldn't be. Like, I would try to raise Ronan's leg, and instead of him just bringing the knee up, and if you brought your leg up in front of you like you would normally, it would be brought sideways for some reason. It'd be like he's raising and twisting his leg, and it looks weird. I don't have a better way to describe it. It just looks weird. I've had this happen before. When I made that mecha model for the animation I did when I was reading the first chapter of book 1, that thing's leg would twist whenever I try to move it, and it was a mess. That's why in the animation you never see it walking. But for the mech model, it was a lot worse than Ronan's model. I still don't know what the issue is with them, and I tried to look up a bunch of ways to troubleshoot it. But one of the troubleshootings, I don't know exactly what I did that got it to work, but eventually I got it so the rotation wasn't that bad or that noticeable. I then did inverse kinematics for the arms, which caused problems because the arms didn't look right when brought down, and rotating them also looked weird, until I realized I had to rotate a different bone to get them to rotate properly. But there was one other problem, and this one wasn't an issue with the inverse kinematics. It was with the topology on the back of the knees, and I only noticed it when I did test posing. I had them in like a superhero landing crouch pose, and I noticed this issue with the knees. I did them horribly wrong, and after a certain point the knees collapse in on themselves, and it looks horrible. I'll throw a picture up on screen. It is... Yeah, you don't want to do that. This is why you have to topologize. When you're retopologizing the knee, you have to be careful. Same thing with the arms, like where the elbow joint is. Otherwise, they collapse on themselves and it just looks like, well, that. I don't really have a better way to describe that. I had to go in and modify the faces to minimize that a bit. I couldn't quite get rid of it, but it does look a lot better. The other issue, which I could have probably solved by weight painting, there's another way you can do it by adding bones here, is that the hips deform in a very weird way, especially during certain poses with the legs. Weight painting, again, I'm going to try and give you like the layman's version, is basically what you're doing is you're painting the model to tell it, like, okay, let's say you have a bone selected in the leg, you then use the weight paint to tell that bone what parts of the model deform. It works on a spectrum. Blue is, think of it like 0 and 1. 1 is the bone is absolutely gonna move that, and 0 is the bone ain't touching it at all. And all the red is 1 and blue is 0. Any colors in between that, it affects like how much the bone moves going from blue to red, basically. But weight painting is one of those things where it can take a while to make sure everything deforms correctly. You can save time by using automatic weights, which is what I did, but sometimes the automatic weights doesn't always do it the way you want, so you're gonna have to go in and modify it by hand, which can take a lot of time. But it was serviceable. Again, I was running out of time here. So once I got that sort of fixed, or at least good enough, I realized I had to do the entire battle suit, and there was just no way I was gonna have that done in time. So I quickly hustled to get the undersuit done, which was just taking the faces of his skin and duplicating them and extruding them outward so they were thicker, and then changing the color of it so it looked like a piece of clothes and not that he had 2 layers of skin, which would look weird as shit. Then I scrambled to at least get the helmet and mask done. That's when I decided that, you know what, for this final animation, he's just gonna have to be a silhouette. As for the sword, I reused a model I made years ago. It's not the best, but it would get the job done. I'd intended to make a new one for that, and I was also going to add a sheath on his back with the suit, so that way the sword could rest in the sheath and then he could draw it, because in the original plan, he was supposed to draw it all dramatically. But, again, time constraints. But I had to go with this one just because time. The rooftop shot was originally going to be way more complicated because he was supposed to sprint across a few rooftops and jump, just flex his agility, you know, parkour mode, all that stuff, and there's supposed to be the moon behind him. He's going to jump towards the camera, and then it would cut to him landing in the street. but I had less than 2 days left at this point. I think I had a day and a half, if I'm being honest. So I had to scrap that and just have him standing on a roof looking down at where the antagonist is raising hell and then have him jump and land. I based the landing poses off of some of the poses from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man because I just really like those movies. But again, I had like a few hours to do this, and like I said, character modeling and animating is one of my weak spots. I really need to work on that, but for the amount of time I had, I was happy with the results. Okay, for real, last thing to cover. I know this is going on for a ridiculously long time. It's gonna take me a while to edit all this together. Good lord. I initially planned on adding sounds to this, and as I said earlier, Joker Blade provided me a video of him shooting a Desert Eagle that was going to use some flashes of gunfire in the establishing shot. But then I realized on the night before the last day that I had absolutely no time to do any of that, because I was going to try and find like some free sound libraries and see if I could find some decent noises for that, but I didn't have time for that because I also had to make music. And then I realized I'm just gonna have to scrap sound and just let music carry it. And the initial plan for that was to fire up LMMS and try to make some music to go with it. While I was making rough edits, I used a song from Armored Core 3, Silent Line Armored Core 3 called Rise in Arms, which is good music, and I used it as a temp track because it had the right intensity I wanted, and it was kind of the vibe I wanted to go with. But here's the thing, unless it's electronic music and mostly relying on a beat, I suck at making music in LMMS. And its samples are a nightmare to work with, and to make them sound good, you have to do a lot of stuff, and I don't know how to do that for most of them. And at this point, I had about 8 hours left. I thought about forking over the cash to buy FL Studio to see if I could crash course that and slam something together really quick, but that software is expensive, and I realized even with that, I doubt I have enough time to make something good, as I had to finish setting up everything for the pre-order so that would be live by the time I premiered it on stream and everything. So I gave up and looked at how much it would cost to use some kind of stock music for a video. After some Googling and digging through different sites, I haven't found a piece of music that I ended up using. Surprisingly, they had an option where you didn't have to pay a cent to use it, you just had to get the license and then include the license ID in the description to avoid a copyright claim. So that's what I went with, and it worked. I'm actually surprised how well the music fit too. I did do some like slight editing, like getting the timing right so it matched what was happening in the scenes and stuff. But overall, I think it turned out pretty good. Alright, I've talked your heads off enough, let's wrap this up. If you made it through all of this, I appreciate you being here, especially since this ain't my usual content. And despite the animation being under 2 minutes long, this was several weeks of work. And there were several times where I was about ready to throw in the towel and do something way simpler, and I'm glad I didn't. If there's one thing I learned from making all of this, it's come up with the idea of doing an animation at least 3 to 4 months in advance before you actually need it so you don't drive yourself mad. Weirdly enough, despite this driving me to the brink of insanity at points and fucking up my already terrible sleep schedule, I still enjoyed it and had fun with the final result. I might work on Ronan's model more, see if I can get it done, sometime around the book's launch, or just for myself to say I've done it. Probably try and do the same for Sierra's model when I've relaxed a bit after doing this. But there's still a lot of things I gotta work on for Book 2's eventual release. I'm probably gonna make more videos talking about the book specifically up until its release date, so look forward to those. I might do a poll on the community tab to see what people would be more interested in me covering first. If you got suggestions of what you want to learn more about with the book, definitely leave it in the comments on this video. But if you did make it through this entire just mammoth of a video, please consider leaving a like and commenting. Also consider checking out my books and pre-ordering Renegades 2. You guys are awesome, and I'll see you all later.
Wow.